Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is One Click LCA's conversation series where we talk to smart people about important topics. And we are joined today by Amy Leedham of Atelier 10. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Today's conversation is going to be really excited. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Travis Dahl, who is a carbon expert here at One Click LCA. How are you doing today, Travis?
Doing great.
Wonderful.
Yep.
So before we get started, the first thing I always ask, we have a global audience and we love to see where you are coming in from. So hop into the comment section if you're viewing us on LinkedIn. If you are viewing us on Livestorm, go into the chat and let us know where you are calling in from. So we love finding out where our audience is coming from. And to go over a few housekeeping rules before we start, and while you're letting us know where you're coming from, we're going to start today's episode with a conversation with Amy. So we'll start by asking her the questions about what strategies she uses to achieve low carbon design. So we'll talk about some of those strategies, some of the targets that we're aiming for, and also some of the nuances in that conversation that you might not always hear. We'll then have a live Q&A session. So if you have questions, hop into the chat, go to the questions tab, or leave your question as a comment on LinkedIn, and we'll gather up all of those questions and we'll round those up and ask them during the live Q&A. So please, if you have a question now, or if you have a question during the chat, definitely let us know. And we'll wrap it all up by challenging Amy to a few questions of our own. So we've got some answers coming in from where you guys are coming from. So we've got Calgary, Canada, we've got Milan, we've got York in the UK, Helsinki, Finland, North Yorkshire in England, Los Angeles, Bangalore, India, Seattle, Washington. We've got lots of people from all over the world. So welcome. We're so glad that you're here. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Travis and let him introduce Amy and get this conversation started.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. So as Eileen said, welcome everybody. This is our 6th episode of Carbon Experts Live. And it's our, as Eileen said, it's our lively discussions with various different experts in the industry. So we can tap into some of the cool things that are happening in the space, some of the challenges that are happening in the space, and trying to resolve some of the complications and difficulties that we're having and just moving this industry forward. So today our topic is embodied carbon limits and design strategies to achieve absolute targets. And I'm excited to be joined with Amy Leedham. Quick bio on Amy is an associate with the San Francisco office of Atelier Ten. She's a registered architect and combines her expertise in building physics and architecture to foster communication between the design team and technical consultants. From corporate sustainability requirements to mixed-use urban developments to single-family homes, Amy has successfully managed projects of all scales with a wide range of ambitious goals, including net zero energy, zero water waste, enhanced occupancy health, and carbon neutrality. Amy leads Atelier 10's carbon practice and has greatly advanced the firm's approach and process to reduce the carbon impact of her projects. So, Amy, I always open these conversations with a bit of a personal question. We want to hear a little bit of your story. So, how did you end up working in sustainable construction? What's really been your driver, your motivation? What brought you here? How did you end up in this position?
Yeah. So like I said, I am a registered architect, and I did suffer through architecture school, like I'm sure a lot of you did. And actually, in my undergrad degree, I had one amazing teacher and one class that he kind of, he brought into our studio class. He started talking to us about sustainability and environmental systems. It wasn't like a formal class on the syllabus or anything. It was just something that he thought was important. And so he kind of imparted it to us, and something about it really resonated with me. And so I actually kind of changed my entire postgraduate trajectory to then go get a degree in focus on building science and sustainability. And so took me a little while to get to sustainable consulting. I tried doing, sustainable design within an architecture firm, and it was a great learning experience. But eventually I found myself at Atelier 10, which was my dream job from when I was in grad school, and really excited to join that firm about 8 years ago, and have been there loving every day of work pretty much ever since.
That's awesome. So what are you working on now that you're at Atelier 10? Like what's interesting you in the industry right now?
Yeah, I mean, so like you said in my bio, I lead our carbon practice, and embodied carbon has been really interesting to me for many years. So at this point, it's probably about 6 years ago now, kind of before people were really talking about it, and the focus was still really on operational carbon, which is obviously super important. But as we kind of took a step back and looked at the bigger picture, um, kind of realized we're missing a whole part of the discussion when we're talking about reducing carbon emissions of buildings. And so started to really focus on embodied carbon, and it's really just grown from there. And it's been really exciting to see it become such an issue for the rest of the industry. Having been in sustainability for quite a while now, I feel like we've spent many years kind of trying to get people to care about energy efficiency and operational carbon. And used many different strategies not relating to carbon, right? Like as proxies for carbon to get people to pay attention to that. And it was really challenging. And yet somehow embodied carbon has had such a fast uptake within the industry, globally even, right? And I think that's really exciting to see so much energy and effort being put into addressing the embodied carbon of buildings.
How have you seen the uptake happen over the last few years? I just spent the last few days at the ASHRAE Energy Conference, and embodied carbon is definitely a huge topic related to that. But of course, operational efficiency is a very complicated animal as well, and was a huge part of this conference. But with that focus that we've had over the last 50 years. I guess how big of an uptake with embodied carbon have you seen, and how quickly is this happening?
Yeah, I feel like it's happening really fast. I would say like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, even 3 years ago, it was kind of just getting folks aware of what embodied carbon was, and convincing them they should do a whole building LCA that looks at kind of the primary building elements, meaning core and shell, basically, right? So structure, foundation, and enclosure. And the uptake of that was actually pretty fast. Like initially, we had to do some convincing of folks, and then very quickly, it turned into our clients asking us to do that for them. So that was pretty cool to see, and I think it's moved really quickly from getting that level of information to all of a sudden, what about all the other things that aren't included in the core and shell definition? And I think to your point about ASHRAE, MEP systems and the embodied carbon of, right, the materials associated with the operational systems is kind of the next big frontier. And it's really cool to see the uptake of that internationally. So I think the UK is a little bit ahead of the US in that regard, but the U.S. is following suit pretty quickly, and I think it's just really, really cool to see how fast it's picking up.
One of the major topics, since we're talking about the ASHRAE event and their focus, is one of the things that was repeatedly coming up was lack of manufacturer data in the MEP space. What kind of response are you getting from the manufacturers in this space, and like are they working on developing EPDs? And just to define EPDs, it's environmental product declarations for anybody who might not be aware. Basically a specification document that showcases the environmental impact or performance of a product. So with that, what kind of response are you getting from the manufacturing space to really fill in that gap?
Yeah, it's pretty varied. So within kind of MEP systems, certain larger manufacturers are maybe better equipped to be able to go through that process, but it's anything where that's a composite product. So a duct might be easy to do an EPD for because it's primarily one material, but any kind of equipment or furniture is another category where there's multiple, many different types of materials coming from all different types of places. It's really challenging to go through that EPD process for a product like that versus, a more typical building product. So some manufacturers already have EPDs, and some are working on getting them. I think my sense is that it's a bit further advanced in places like the UK, where there are more guidelines and regulations around quantifying the full embodied carbon footprint of a project. So London has some pretty robust requirements around that, and I think that's driving more manufacturers to go through the process than somewhere like the US, where we don't have regulations around that yet.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned quantifying these impacts, and really this is the topic that we wanted to cover. With how do we quantify this and how do we measure this? Ultimately, we want to get to talking about hard targets, but before we get there, how do we measure this?
Great question. The primary tool is something called whole building life cycle assessment. But even that can mean a wide range of things depending on where you're located or which kind of technical standards you are referencing. But fundamentally, it's just a quantification of all of the building materials that are in a project, as well as their environmental impacts. And so, again, the definition of whole building is actually quite wide. So one example is the LEED reference guide, which is very popular in North America. They have certain points associated with doing what they call a whole building LCA, but they only require you to account for the core and shell. They don't require interiors. You don't have to do anything around mechanical systems. And that's in large part driven by data availability. Whereas, again, like I was mentioning, some of the standards in like the Greater London Authority or the RIC standards are kind of looking for a picture of the true whole building. So they're asking you to account for interiors as well as HVAC systems. And so really quickly, terminology and understanding assumptions becomes really important, because someone could be saying whole building LCA and it could mean something very different depending on what's included in that assessment. And so that makes comparing of results from whole building LCAs very challenging, because you want to make sure that they're accounting for the same level of information for them to be able to be compared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've got a question I want to come back to, but what are we talking about when we talk about hard targets?
Yes. So I'll use LEED as an example again, because again, it's the kind of primary driver for a lot of our clients in North America for doing the whole building LCA. So LEED awards a certain number of points within their rating system for just doing an LCA. If you demonstrate a 5% reduction from a baseline, you get 2 points. And if you demonstrate a 10% reduction from baseline, you achieve 3 points. Those are not that's not an example of a hard target, right? That is a reduction-based target for a project. And it's very dependent on how you set your baseline. And I think unlike energy modeling, which has really quite prescriptive requirements for how to set a baseline, there's a lot more variability in a baseline for a whole building LCA, in large part because of just the variety of options in structural system design or facade design to achieve the same level of performance, right? I think that's really what's driving it. And so it can be really challenging for people to wrap their head around how good is my project with these reduction-based targets, or how do I know that my embodied carbon footprint is like doing the right thing, or it's good in relation to the global carbon kind of crisis or issue, whatever you want to call it, right? I think those are the types of questions that a reduction-based target does not help you answer. And so we've done some work with some of our clients to try to establish an absolute target. And the theory there is it's a simplified target. It says based on how much carbon emission budget we have globally for everything, and based on some kind of nuanced calculations about how much of that carbon budget should be allowed for the building industry to take up, this is the maximum amount of carbon that any project globally should have for embodied carbon. That's the desire, right? And that's something that anybody can understand and grasp, right? It's like, in order to stay under 1.5 degrees C temperature increase, this is the maximum amount of embodied carbon that your building's allowed to have. And it's kind of the same for everybody, right? It's very like egalitarian in that way. That's easy to grasp, not super nuanced, I think. And that's the ideal. But as we've kind of started to allude to, there's a lot of different ways that folks might include or exclude certain components of a building in their assessment. And it gets really tricky about that single number that, theoretically applies globally. What does that include? And does that align with how the UK is addressing embodied carbon? And is that easily tracked with how most people in the US or North America are tracking embodied carbon? So it gets very complicated very quickly, but the goal, the desire behind this idea of an absolute target is to simplify it and to tie it to planetary boundaries.
Yeah, so I love the terminology of using budget accounting and looking at the total amount that we have to emit, and basically structuring a budget to help us get to that path, because ultimately we're overspending currently. So if we're going to keep doing what we're doing now, that's not going to work. So do you have any idea of what the targets are that we need to hit, and like what are these, if we have them, what are they based on?
Yeah. So we did some, like I mentioned, we did some work last year for a client to figure this out. And we presented it at ILFI, our Living Futures conference, earlier this year. So we determined, and again, this number, the idea is to have a single number, but the reality is the number changes on a daily basis as we spend more of our carbon budget globally. So as of May this year, the number for core and shell plus interiors was 185 kg CO2e per meter squared. And like I said, we took a very simplified approach. We're kind of saying, doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter the size of your building, doesn't matter the type of your building, based on, right, how much carbon we should be spending in the building industry, and based on our projected amount of building per year in order to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is kind of the new IPCC target. Every single building between now and then needs to stay under 185 kg CO2 per meter squared. Very simplified. Since then, since we did this work, a kind of new initiative has been launched called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it takes a very similar approach in terms of taking the global carbon budget and downscaling it to building scale embodied carbon targets. They break it down, and actually they allow for higher spending now and less spending later. So while ours is like a constant line of 185 the whole time, theirs is like, well, the technology's not there right now, so you can spend more now. But if we do that, it means we're going to have to spend less later. So I get why they're doing that, but from my perspective, it's really dangerous to say, well, let's allow ourselves to spend more now because we aren't able to hit that target for every building. But it's just kind of kicking the can down the road. So again, I think they've done amazing work, and they've broken it down in a lot more detail than the approach we took. But I do think there's some danger in kicking the can down the road.
How would you respond to that question of, we don't have the technology to do it now?
Yes, I think it's a great point, right? Not every single building currently has well, I don't think that's true. I think that if capitalism was set up differently, I think we could be hitting 185 on every single building right now. and with the full range of structural materials that buildings need to be, right? There is no single solution that's going to solve this for globally, right? So some examples we gave when we presented this were some mass timber projects that were able to get under 185. That's a whole other can of worms, but I don't think anybody is saying that every single building in the world should be mass timber, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's not feasible. So it really relies on concrete and steel industries to decarbonize rapidly. And they're working on it. But again, the financial models are not set up to truly incentivize them to do it as fast as they probably could if the policy and the finance were there to do it. So on the other hand of that, I think it's better to aim really high. And even if you don't quite get there, you still probably did better than you would have if you had a lower set goal, right? So I think I appreciate that it can be scary to set a really big, ambitious goal like 185 because of the fear of not achieving that goal. But I do think it's better to still have that kind of North Star target and not quite achieve it, but at least still make more progress than if you had a less ambitious goal.
Yeah, with having specific, if let's say we globally set the target at 185, and that was the standard for every new building that's being developed, how would we approach this in different regions, or what are some of the complications that we might run into different regions? So whether it's regions that might have different access to materials, as you just alluded to, or there might be seismic requirements, or maybe water or infestation issues. How do we approach this, and what are some of those challenges that we have to address?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's a very valid point that having a single goal globally for every region is a bit simplistic, right? And it doesn't allow for maybe developing countries to kind of have their fair share of carbon spending, right? I think that's a equity issue that comes up quite a bit when we're talking about any type of carbon cap, right? And I think I don't have a great answer for that, honestly. I think my personal opinion is probably biased because of where I am from, and so it's really hard for me to have a fully rounded point of view on that. But I think some of the issues that we've already come up against is, like I said, this 185 is corn shell plus interiors, but it's not talking about some of the things we mentioned earlier in the discussion around MEP systems, furniture, right? It's not like the true full footprint of the building. Whereas in the UK, our colleagues there, because of regulations, they are quantifying the full impact of the building. And so their numbers for their LCAs that they're doing are much higher than 185. And like mass timber is not a solution there because of very strict fire codes. And so they're kind of at a very different end of the spectrum than 185. And it's in part because they're including more in that number, right? So I think that's a really big part of the challenge that you have to address regionally is just like being able to compare apples to apples. And then, just the availability of technologies. But again, I think it's just all about how you orient it, right? It's like, as a designer, which is what a lot of us are, or as an architect, or whatever your role is, unless you run and own a massive steel plant, like you do not have the power yourself to change the industry, right, to achieve it. So I think the approach is to really kind of take that target as a North Star. If you need to scale it or scale your results to align with how you look at embodied carbon in your region, I think that's fine. And then do whatever you can that's within your power to get there, and to move the industry forward. So in some places, it might just mean asking about, like starting to have the discussion about lower carbon concrete, if that's not like a typical thing in your region, right? Or asking manufacturers for EPDs or other GWP related information. It's like you kind of have to do what is within your power to do for your project.
One of the things that I like in regards to the equity question, one of the things that I run into a lot in North America is the argument that if everybody else isn't doing it, we shouldn't have to do it either, because it makes it an unfair playing field. But the fact is that we do have the technology, and we have the ability and a lot of the skill sets to decarbonize our industries and build these lower carbon buildings, and possibly the ability to beat that 185 target. Which, going back to the budget conversation, opens up some additional room for the developing regions in the world to have a little bit of that extra budget to build the industries that they need to get there. One of the things that we've seen in a lot of industries, like mobile phone access, is a great example, or internet access, where developing countries have just leapfrogged from practically nothing to 5G internet or 4G internet, whatever it is, just because why would they go through the painful process of building the archaic infrastructure that we've already graduated from, just so that they can get to whatever the current technology is? It just makes sense for them to build things in a modernized way. And I don't have the answer for that. I don't know what the best path is for that, or if that's actually really the case in every scenario. But if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, I'll kind of lob that over to you. But just if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Right, I think that those are some great examples, and I think the uptake of solar, right, is another example on the operational side of just like how rapidly countries like India are implementing renewable energy. Right, they're kind of, to your point, they're like, why would we install like fossil fuel based energy systems when we can just skip that altogether? And the hope is that would be true for, steel and concrete industries in those countries as well. But I honestly, I just don't know if that's what's happening. So hopefully it is.
So yeah. And coming back to the 185 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared, what are some of the design strategies that you've used or you are using to get there?
Yeah, so like I said, currently the primary strategy that we've had for new buildings is based on mass timber, the use of mass timber, sustainably harvested mass timber, but also using that in a way that makes sense for the building type, right? So our mass timber projects that are really achieving low embodied carbon, it's also because they're using wood in the way that wood wants to be used, right? We're not trying to make timber do something that it doesn't want to do. So really it just means a certain size of grid, and you end up with fairly regularized looking buildings in terms of massing. I think projects that try to use mass timber for much more complex massings end up having to add a whole lot of steel, and in which case, right, you're not really reducing the embodied carbon footprint of the building. And I would also say that in most of those projects, it is not just like mass timber alone doesn't always get us under that 185. It also requires maximizing low carbon strategies for concrete as much as possible. So really close coordination with the concrete supplier. We like to use pretty open performance-based specs that allow flexibility for the concrete manufacturer to do whatever it's in their power to do to hit a GWP target, instead of more prescriptive, us prescribing a pathway for them, because they're the experts, right? Let them do what they do best. And then I would say this is where it gets a bit nuanced, but we've had projects that were going to tear down a building and build a new building, and instead decided to keep that building and do just a really extensive renovation and adaptive reuse. And so in that case, the other option was a new building, and so they spent way less embodied carbon renovating an existing building instead of building a new building. And I think that's also a really viable strategy right now.
We say once in a while, getting as close to doing nothing as possible. It's and renovations tend to be that solution. You mentioned cost as well, like or spent rather, and how do your clients tend to respond, and like do they have expectations around cost increases for reducing emissions on their projects, and how do you address that?
Yes, they do. I would say we try to address it by removing as many third party or making the game of telephone as small as possible. So I think owners want an understanding of cost of any of these big decisions as early as possible. And often that means, getting costs from either a cost estimator or a general contractor if they're on board already. In the U.S., we don't have quantity surveyors with the way they do in the U.K. So it's a bit more of a muddy process. And we have found that when cost estimates for some of these newer or less common technologies come from the two entities I mentioned, there's a really big upcharge for just kind of the unknown factor. And then that can remove it from feasibility for the owner's perspective. Our solution to that is to try to connect directly with a supplier or a manufacturer, many of whom are happy to have that discussion even before they're on board the project in order to help kind of get realistic costs, which are almost always way lower than if they're coming from, again, that other group that I mentioned, to help the owner get on board with the decision. So again, removing the middle people as much as possible can really help understand the technical requirements of whatever strategy, whether it's mass timber construction or low embodied carbon concrete. And it can also really help understand schedule impacts if there are any, and cost, all of which obviously impact the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like you partially answered my next question, which is how do we influence design making by making the right decisions, the easy ones to make. You mentioned getting direct communication with those decision makers, but how do we also structure either the decision making process or the design of the project as well, to make those decisions easier to make?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it really depends. I mean, the reality is so many projects globally are regulation driven, right? And so I think we've seen a big uptick in embodied carbon because there have been kind of at the local level anyway, more and more regulations addressing different aspects of embodied carbon. And so I think that's like a real part of this, right, is the regulations. I think on the incentivizing it side, I think it really is just about education and awareness. And so trying to be in the room or involved as early as possible to be able to provide or at least connect the owner with the expert to be able to, again, get whatever questions or fears that they may have about a specific technology, get them talking to the actual person doing the technology to assuage their fears, right? So some of the fears we hear from mass timber is fire rating and cost, and cost can be really offset by schedule. So in North America, if you can save a few weeks on your construction timeline, that ends up being millions of dollars because of how high labor costs are in the US, right? And we've seen some great data come out of the mass timber conference last year showing up to a 25% reduction in construction schedule from using mass timber. So I think being able to help an owner take a more holistic view of potential cost and benefit of a specific technology, and address whatever specific questions they have with evidence, right, can really help with the decision making around some of these more innovative, I'll say, technologies or strategies.
Mm-hmm. And we've been kind of skirting the issue of holistic carbon assessment and taking in both operational emissions as well as embodied carbon, and then looking at the embodied carbon scope as well, taking the whole building into account. What about site work and landscaping and things like this? It's a fairly complicated piece of the spectrum. How do builders effectively approach this? And what are some of the boundaries that they might struggle with when tracking equipment usage that might be shared between different sites and things like that? No.
I think it looks like Amy might be having some connectivity issues. So Travis, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic. I know that you have a background in the construction industry, and you talk to builders and developers and designers every day. Have you seen anyone implement solutions to those problems, or effective ways to measure those types of emissions, and what that looks like?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a hard one to answer. I've spoken to a number of firms that are doing this, and the way that, as I suggested, one of the challenges that they're running into is, yes, a lot of the equipment that comes to a site it does spend most of its time there, but when we're modeling the emissions related to that equipment, if the piece of equipment's just staying on site, let's say it's a front loader or something like that, and it's spending the project on that site, tracking the fuel consumption, and we have good data for the emissions related to hourly fuel consumption for that piece of equipment and maintenance and so on. One of the challenges I think that a lot of firms are running into is do they account for the embodied carbon that goes into that piece of equipment when it was being manufactured, and with the life cycle of that piece of equipment, tracking the I guess the full life cycle, and accounting and applying that piece to the project is something that definitely gets a lot more complicated. Also, when we have deliveries, like maybe a company has a truck that's that's delivering materials to a site, and that it's being shared amongst, let's say, 30 different sites throughout a day. Those things definitely get a lot more complicated. But we do have Amy back, so it's
sorry.
All good. Maybe I'm not sure if you caught the entirety of that question before you dropped off.
It was about operational and embodied and holistic carbon, right?
And yeah, tracking things like site operations and landscaping and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think all of that ties to this idea, right, of the whole project embodied carbon, right, and being a bit more inclusive and addressing all of those. And I think when we've done these analyses where we have been able to look at all of the pieces together, I think it's really interesting how the priorities change based on the type of project or the location. So in some areas where there's a relatively clean grid, so we work in California a lot, right? So pretty mild climate for most of the state, for the most part, and a relatively clean grid. We see embodied carbon as a really big kind of holistic carbon driver. Already have pretty robust state energy code. They now require PVs on some certain types of project, right? So the operational side is being pushed pretty far by regulation already. Whereas in other places that might have more extreme climates and also have coal as a primary fuel source for their grid region, we actually see kind of energy efficiency and operational carbon strategies being as important, if not more important, than embodied carbon. And I think it also depends on the timeline you're looking at too, right? So embodied carbon is spent, if we're going to use that same analogy, by the time the building opens, right? Whereas operational carbon ends up being able to be remedied more easily throughout the life of the building, either through replacing systems, which inevitably is going to happen, and or adding on-site renewable energy if that's a strategy. So I think being able to look at the two, operational embodied, together, and then starting to add in things like landscape and construction emissions, just really helps with prioritization, because we do see different issues in different regions.
Yeah, and we're going to be having a conversation with Jeremy Field in a couple of months, and a major topic is going to be the time value of carbon, and how do we look at this and address it, and look at it with coming back to accounting principles and applying a value to that. But I wanted you to tell you, we were talking earlier, and you mentioned a project for San Mateo that you were doing. Can you tell us about that and some of the lessons that you learned there?
Yeah, I think it's a really great example because it's a county office building for San Mateo County in California. So it's a publicly funded public project, and it is net zero energy, and it fell under that 185 kg CO2e per meter squared target. It does use mass timber, but again, when you look at the form of the building, it really speaks to leveraging kind of the power of timber and wood, and like what wood wants to do from in a structural standpoint. And so it's a beautiful building. It's a publicly funded building, and yet it was also able to achieve net zero energy and stay under this 185 kg CO2 per meter squared limit. So I just think it's a great example of kind of, it doesn't always have to be right, a big tech company or some privately funded project that's spending a whole bunch of money to achieve these ambitious targets.
I'm going to jump in here. I think that is a great place to end off. I think these conversations are always so interesting. I love all of the nuance in the conversation today. Some of the topics that we don't always get into, how we deal with some of these sort of equality versus egalitarian issues, and how we can approach this. But I love ending on this high note of an example, like you said, publicly funded and able to achieve these hard targets. So it is doable, and it can be a beautiful building as well. So that's absolutely wonderful. We are going to jump now into the live Q&A. We've gotten quite a few questions coming through on both LinkedIn and our Livestorm platform. And so the first one is, can you speak on the interplay between carbon credits and embodied carbon? So I know carbon credits can sometimes also be a bit of a controversial topic depending on how they're applied. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the idea of carbon credits makes sense, right? Because it's kind of in line with procuring off-site renewable energy. Not every single building is going to be able to have meaningful on-site solar. Not every single building is going to be able to be mass timber or use super low carbon concrete or steel, even when it's publicly available, for a variety of reasons. And so having an option for projects or portfolios to basically offset their carbon impact by purchasing something, the theory of that makes a lot of sense. I think where we are right now is without really robust regulation about making sure that those carbon credits are tied to real world increase in carbon storage or carbon removal. It's really, the onus is really on the person or organization buying them to kind of do that work to make sure that what they're buying has a meaningful impact. And I think the science is still pretty gray on what a lot of these options that exist for carbon credits. So I think the intention is great. I think there are some options out there that are tied to real meaningful reduction in carbon emissions, but I think it's really hard to navigate at the moment.
Yeah, I think with carbon credits, it's a system that's been around for quite a number of years now, and there are still a number of older credits that are floating around that are tied to questionable questionable projects. We hear a lot about the greenwashing projects that are still going on, where you get a series of credits for not deforesting a section of forest that was really never intended to be cut down anyway, and applying credits to these. But there are meaningful scenarios where they're being applied in regions that, using Alberta as an example, where I live, where it's most of our electricity is still predominantly generated by coal. A lot of that being converted to natural gas, but the question still the scenario is still in place where we have pretty high carbon intensive energy grid. So any solar that's going in is really offsetting the requirement for those systems that can easily ramp up and ramp down in comparison to a lot of other systems, and applying those to operations where we can't decarbonize them as quickly or as easily. And really, it's just a way of internalizing pollution or real financial costs that are going to happen down the line. We're just figuring out a way to apply that cost up front.
That's great. I think the next question is coming up here on the screen. Here we go. So this one, Amy, especially you being located out of San Francisco or the San Francisco office, we have a question about California has established regulations on embodied carbon. How is the policy landscape in the U.S. changing with respect to embodied carbon, and is this shift positive? We've seen a lot of things coming out of California. So what are your thoughts here? Is California going to lead the way again?
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised at the uptick of this. Last year, I was on a advocacy board, kind of trying to figure out how to get regulations around embodied carbon, with the assumption that the state agency, who's usually very slow to make changes, would not make this change as quickly as they did. So it's really cool to see that they have added the requirements around embodied carbon to the state code. I also want to give a shout out to New York. So I think California is leading the way in that they established this additional regulation pretty quickly, but New York did include, New York City did include embodied carbon in Local Law 97. So the embodied carbon aspect of Local Law 97 is not in place yet, as far as I understand. They're still kind of gathering information, but theoretically that would apply a carbon cap to a total carbon cap, so operational and embodied carbon, to projects in New York City. And if you exceed that cap, you have to pay. So that already exists on the operational side, and they are rolling in the embodied side. So I think New York is taking a different approach, which is super interesting, and again comes to this idea of an absolute, more of an absolute cap. And I think it is positive. I think, like I said, so like just the way capitalism works is that the majority of projects are going to be driven by regulation, and they're just going to do what they have to do. And so I think addressing embodied carbon in regulation is a positive thing. It would be nice if every single state in the US had an energy code. That would be a good start, but we don't have that. It's for those not familiar with the US, every state has its the ability to set or not set an energy code, and there's certain states that just don't have an energy code, and it's even more localized than that. So I think we're still a long way from the entire country having regulations to address both embodied and operational, but I do think there's obviously a pretty quick uptick here of the major development hubs having regulations around embodied carbon. And I think there's going to be pain points, but I do think it's a good thing in order to drive the industry where we need to be to address carbon emissions.
Yeah, I think that is so important. I was gonna toss the ball over to Travis and see what your perspective. Obviously, you can talk about the states as well, but do you have a perspective on, is this driving change up in Canada?
Actually, it is where there are a number of programs that are following the lead of things that are happening in California. For example, the Buy Clean Act is being it's in discussions to be implemented at the federal level as well, and I totally agree with everything Amy just said. There's the fundamental things that we really need to target with like regional energy codes, but getting into the specifics of like the California Act that's just been released. I've kind of flipped through some of the pages, and one of the things that I felt it's exciting to see that it's happening but there's also I felt it was unclear on the scope of what's going to be required for these projects, and tying back into what we were speaking about earlier, having that whole building, that holistic whole building, everything that's happening related to the project being accounted for, is still something we need to work towards.
Yeah, I was speaking to a coworker, and she said that she sees the sort of American way as sometimes just going forward and doing something without really always thinking it through, which can be the case. But, hopefully, like you said, Amy, there may be pain points as we go forward and try to enact these different regulations, but we're heading in the right direction. So our last question,
Eileen, that's that's just a great point. And as painful and inefficient as it might seem sometimes, it's also the best way to innovate. You actually put out something that's half-cocked and figure out what the problems are once it's actually in effect, rather than trying to figure out before testing it what those pain points might actually be, and then addressing them and making it better as we progress.
Yeah, that's great. Really, really hopeful outlook. I love it. So this last question from the live Q&A, we still have our questions, but what are the top 3 to 4 strategies that you are seeing being implemented that have the greatest reduction in embodied carbon? So I'm going to challenge you to say the top 1 or 2 strategies. And I know you've talked about a bunch of different things, but what are those sort of 2 that you would tell people to focus the most on?
I'm going to leave it to 1, and I'm going to say close coordination as early as possible. So there is no one strategy that is most effective. But if you are able to bring the team together with the shared goal of reducing embodied carbon early, innovations can happen. And it might be a slightly more efficient structural design than what is a kind of typical approach, right? But within the same materials, it could be getting creative with the schedule to be able to achieve the same construction timeline, but have longer curing times for lower GWP concrete, right? Like what the actual strategies are going to be so dependent on what's feasible for your project, your region, your budget. But I think leveraging the brain power and creativity of all the team members as early as possible around that shared goal is the most effective way.
Awesome. Well, we will leave our audience with that excellent tip, and take it with you and apply it to all of your projects. Now we will move on to our questions that we have for Amy. This is a question that we ask all of our guests here on Carbon Experts Live. It's been fantastic to hear the different perspectives, but it's, if you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be? So we asked you a one thing question just now. Here's another one thing question for you.
Yeah, I chose perception because I truly think that if everyone actually believed that reducing carbon emissions was the key to kind of saving the future of our planet, then everything else we need to make that happen would fall into place, right? There would be financial backing for it. There would be policies that support it. There would be innovation that gets us there in the timely fashion, right? It's kind of the mobilizing for war effect, right? It's like when all of a sudden we go to war, we're able to find all of these resources and everything that we kind of didn't really know was there. And I think if everybody had the same urgency around this issue, then everything would fall into place.
That's a fantastic point. It's definitely, as a communicator, I work in the communications department. I understand that perception is everything, and it can make a huge difference. Now, this next question is actually from last month's guest, who was Josie Cadwallader-Hughes of Thicum, and she asked, do you talk about sustainability in the same way in all regions, or do you approach it differently in different countries? We kind of jumped on this topic a little bit, but how do you personally talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely tailor an approach to a specific region, in part because different regions have different priorities, right? Coming from climate, urban or not urban context, policy, just kind of culture, all of that drives an approach to sustainability. Um, but that being said, I think the overall process is quite the same in terms of just really trying to understand what are the drivers, both coming from the client group, but also the local environment, collectively kind of aligning around shared goals. Again, that my previous point of if everyone is really invested and believes in the goals for the project, it makes it a lot easier to achieve. And then, the specific strategies to achieve those goals will be very different depending on which region you're in. But the overall approach of, a kind of tailored and collaborative process is the same regardless of where we're working.
I like that. Different methods, but to achieve the same end results. That's fantastic. Well, our next guest, as you can see on the screen, will be Josephina Lindblom. She's the Senior Policy Officer at the European Commission. And what question do you want us to challenge her with next month when we have her on the show?
Yeah, I'd really love to know what she sees as the biggest opportunity from implementing kind of circular economy principles to reduce the carbon emissions of building products.
Fantastic. I'm excited. I'll be excited to challenge her with that question next month, and we'll see what she has to say. So that about wraps up our show for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Really quick, before you guys, before our audience starts heading out, I want to let you know that we have a lot of embodied carbon policy resources in our library, which you can see on our website. So feel free, if you want to learn more, to check that out online. The other resource that we have is our eco design in practice articles, and we have a 10 design commandments article. So if you want some how-tos and some sort of basic tips and tricks, you can go to our website and check out these articles as well. And lastly, we also have some free training coming up in October. So we talked about EPDs today, these environmental product declarations. If you guys want to learn more about those, you want to take a full dive and become an EPD expert, you should join our EPD bootcamp in October. It is a free training session. It's a week long. It's a few hours every day. So it's an excellent opportunity to learn all about EPDs. And then lastly, if you want to keep this conversation going with Amy or Travis, you can see their contact information is on the screen here. So definitely reach out if you have more questions for them. You can also reach us at Click LCA. We've got our contact information up on the screen. And Travis, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap this up with your final thoughts and any last questions you have.
Yeah, no, this is great. I guess, Amy, if is there anywhere that people can find you if they wanted to know more about your work, or they want to connect with you outside of your email address there?
No, that's the best place. My LinkedIn is there, I think, too. So either one works great. Those are the best places to catch me.
Perfect. And just as we wrap up, if anybody has any recommendations of anybody that they would love to hear from, we'd love to get any feedback and suggestions. Feel free to reach out to either myself or hello@oneclicklca.com. And that's it from us. We're going to sign out.
Yeah, and just real quick, next month's guest, like we mentioned earlier, it's going to be Josephina Lindblom. That episode is going to be on the 25th of October. So mark your calendars today so that you don't forget. And we will see you again next month.
Thank you.